I was kneeling on the yellowed grass in the backyard, gripping a rot-blackened plank of wood while Knox, my old shepherd, lay wheezing beside me. The smell of rust from the toolbox mixed with damp earth, a scent that felt like home. It was a Tuesday afternoon, empty, quiet, and tedious. Then came the crunch of gravel from the driveway. A man in a cheap windbreaker walked up. No smile. He held out a thick manila envelope. "Ms. Holland, for you." The world went silent. My chest tightened, heart drumming a dry rhythm against my ears. The hammer slipped from my hand, thudding into the dirt. The stiff paper of the envelope scraped my palm, carrying the cold, embossed seal of the Portsmouth Civil County Court. It wasn't a traffic ticket. My military eyes scanned the bold print. Plaintiff, Daniel Holland. Defendant, Nicole Holland. My own father was suing me to strip my inheritance, accusing me of being irresponsible and abandoning the family. The Virginia humidity hung heavy, thick enough to swallow a person whole. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at that one word, irresponsible. My hands were a map of calluses and old nicks, the kind you get from stripping a rifle in the dark or patching a roof that's given up on life. While I was out here sweating in a faded gray tee, Daniel was probably at the country club. I could see him. Sipping a double bourbon, ice clinking against lead crystal, telling his golf buddies how his unreformed daughter had finally crossed the line. I didn't cry. Tears were a luxury I'd left behind in a dust-choked forward operating base 10 years ago. I folded the papers once, a sharp surgical crease. Knox nudged my knee, his breath a ragged whistle. I patted his head, feeling the coarse fur under my fingers. "Inside, boy," I muttered. My voice sounded like gravel under a boot. I stepped through the back door. The house was a tomb. It smelled like pine sol and old grievances. I walked down the hallway, my boots echoing on the hardwood. There were no photos of me on the walls. None. Just Daniel and my two brothers, chests puffed out, grinning over tennis trophies. I was the ghost in the machine. The one who came home from an 18-month deployment just to find out her existence was a line item in a lawsuit. I sat at the scarred kitchen table and cracked the laptop. I didn't call him. I didn't scream. A soldier doesn't react with noise. A soldier reacts with data. I logged into the military pay portal, my fingers moving with the mechanical precision of a pre-flight checklist. I downloaded my deployment history. Then, I pulled the bank statements. The screen flickered, the blue light casting sharp shadows across my face. I started hunting, tracking every cent, every dollar. The numbers told the real story. Rhythmic thefts, steady as a heartbeat. Transaction codes, property tax, roof repair, utility arrears. Every single dime pulled from my hazard pay. That was blood money. I earned those dollars patrolling minefields, breathing in the toxic smoke of burned pits while the sun baked my brains. Daniel had been using my sacrifice to fund his upper-middle-class charade. He used my money to keep the lights on and the lawn manicured so he wouldn't lose face with the neighbors. And now? Now he was using the law to kick me to the curb. He wasn't just taking the house. He was weaponizing my service, turning my time in the sand into proof that I'd abandoned him. I closed the laptop with a soft, final thud. My jaw was locked so tight it ached. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated purge. I walked into the bedroom and hauled the olive-drab metal footlocker from under the bed. The padlock popped with a heavy metallic clack that seemed to rattle the very foundation of the room. I reached inside. My fingers brushed the wool of my dress blues. Cold. Heavy. I ran my thumb over a frayed stitch on the chest ribbon, the spot where I'd snagged it on a gear crate the day I left home. A civilian lawyer would argue for a fair split of the estate. They'd talk about feelings and family bonds. But I didn't want a piece of his lies. I wanted to burn his mask to ash. I pulled my phone from my pocket. No more playing nice. I typed a message to the bank manager at the local branch. I need certified hard copies of all statements for the last 8 years. Stamped, notarized, everything. I looked at the uniform again. The brass buttons caught the dim evening light. Daniel wanted a war. I was going to give him one. I wasn't defending a house anymore. I was taking the hill. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The real battle was just beginning. The printer whirred, a rhythmic mechanical wheeze that cut through the dead air of my bedroom. Whir, click, slide. The blue light from the monitor bled onto my skin, making the scars on my knuckles look like deep, purple trenches. I didn't blink. I just watched the paper slide out, crisp and white, onto the floor. I reached down and snatched the first sheet. August 14th, 2004. The date hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, the smell of cheap printer ink was gone. In its place was the heavy, suffocating scent of garlic butter and seared beef. My throat tightened. I was 12 years old again, standing in the doorway of our dining room in Portsmouth, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was clutching a first-place plaque from the state science fair. The wood was cheap, the gold plastic trim was peeling at the corners, but to me, it was a shield. I'd spent 6 months on that project. 6 months of bleeding over circuit boards and library books just to see Daniel's face light up for once. I just wanted a nod. A good job, kid. Something to prove I existed. Daniel sat at the head of the long oak table, silver knife glinting as he sliced into a thick ribeye. Our neighbor, Bill, had stopped by to borrow a wrench and was leaning against the doorframe. "Damn, Dan," Bill whistled, pointing at me. "Look at that. First place in the whole state. Your girl's a genius." Daniel didn't stop cutting. He didn't even look up. He chewed a piece of steak, slow and deliberate, then wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. "The football team," Daniel said, his voice flat and bored. "Mark's squad. They've got a real shot at the state finals this year. Now that is something worth talking about." The silence that followed was louder than a gunshot. Bill shifted his weight, looking at his boots, embarrassed for me. I stood there, the plaque suddenly feeling like a lead weight. My win wasn't a victory. It was an inconvenience. A footnote in the story of my brothers. Daniel had wiped me out with a shrug. I blinked, and the dining room vanished. I was back in the present, the blue monitor light stinging my eyes. I reached for a yellow highlighter on the desk. I found the entry I was looking for. October 2016. $4,500. I dragged the yellow ink across the numbers. A jagged, bright streak. Daniel had called me that month. I was sitting in a Humvee, sweat stinking up my vest, the heat outside pushing a brutal 113 degrees. He didn't ask if I was safe. He didn't ask if I was coming home. He whined. He told me the roof was leaking and it made him look poor in front of the neighborhood association. He treated my hazard pay like a personal slush fund. To him, I wasn't a daughter or a soldier. I was an ATM with a pulse. I'd been dodging IEDs while he was picking out shingles with my blood money. Every yellow line I drew on these papers felt like a cut, a strike back at the years of being his silent provider. The stack of papers grew into a thick, heavy pile. It wasn't just bank statements anymore, it was a map, a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to his greed. He'd kept me on the edge of the frame my whole life, but he'd sure as hell drained me dry to keep himself in the center. If you've ever stood in a room full of family and felt like a total ghost, hit that like button right now. I need to know I'm not the only one. Drop a me in the comments if you've ever had to pay for a house you weren't even allowed to call home. Let's show them we aren't invisible anymore. The printer gave one last dying groan and went silent. The final sheet of paper slid out, landing face up on top of the pile. September 18th, 2009. The day I signed my life over to the United States Army. The day I thought I was finally escaping him. My eyes went dark as I stared at the signature. I had traded one war for another, but this time, the enemy was sleeping in the house I'd paid for. The living room was a graveyard of silence, lit only by the blue flicker of the evening news. I stood at the front door, the weight of an olive-drab canvas duffel biting into my shoulder. I was 21, raw and ready to bleed for something bigger than myself. Daniel didn't stand up. He sat in his leather armchair, eyes glued to the TV, a half-empty glass of scotch sweating on the side table. I reached for the brass knob. I waited for a "be safe" or a "good luck, Nick." anything to bridge the canyon between us. Just go ahead and run away, Daniel said. His voice was sandpaper, dry and full of contempt. He didn't even turn his head. You're joining up because you're desperate for attention. You think putting on a uniform makes you special? It won't. You'll just be another gear in a machine that doesn't care about you. The words hit like a gut shot. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I just stepped out into the humid Virginia night and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. 7 years later, that machine Daniel talked about was the only thing keeping me alive. I was sitting on a stack of sandbags at a clapped-out outpost in the Middle East. The wind howled, carrying grit that felt like needles against my face. My skin was a mess of charcoal dust and dried sweat. I had just finished commanding a CASEVAC, pulling 4 of my soldiers out of a hot zone under a hail of lead. My hands were still shaking, just a little. I tore open a packet of MRE beef jerky with my teeth. It tasted like salty cardboard and chemical preservatives. Far off, a flare hissed across the blackened sky, turning the dunes a sickly neon green. No birds sang here, only the low, bone-deep growl of the diesel generators. I pulled out my satellite phone, hoping for a shred of home. One message, just one. Bank says property taxes are 2 days late. The text from Daniel read, "How the hell are you handling your business over there? Figure it out." I stared at the screen until the light burned my retinas. No, are you okay? No, heard there was a skirmish near your sector. Just the tax bill for the house I was paying for while he slept in a bed I'd bought. I tucked the phone away and chewed the dry meat until my jaw ached. Then the radio crackled. Static hissed, followed by a series of coded numbers. The air left my lungs. My grandfather was gone. In a base that smelled like JP-8 fuel and unwashed bodies, I had no room for tears. A counterattack was spooling up. Orders were being barked. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the old brass compass. It was scratched, the glass cracked from a fall in basic training, but the needle still hunted for north. Grandpa had pressed it into my hand before his mind started to slip away. Always know where you are, Nick, his voice echoed in the back of my mind, even when nobody else is looking. I gripped the cold metal, feeling the bite of the brass against my palm. I swallowed the lump in my throat, shoved the compass back into my pocket, and picked up my rifle. I opened my eyes. The desert was gone. The dawn light was bleeding across the sky in Portsmouth, a deep, bruised red. It was court day. Hour G. I stepped into the shower, letting the ice-cold water shock my system into focus. No coffee, just adrenaline and the weight of the task ahead. I pulled the dress blues from the locker. I moved with a mechanical rhythm. Button, loop, align. The brass buttons caught the light, polished to a mirror finish. I pinned the campaign ribbons to my left breast, one by one. Every strip of colored fabric was a month of my life spent in the dirt. Every medal was a scar Daniel hadn't seen. I slid the grandfather's compass into my breast pocket, right over my heart. I grabbed the thick leather folder, the map of Daniel's greed, and tucked it under my arm. My boots hit the floorboards with a sharp, disciplined thud. This wasn't a defense anymore. This was a tactical strike. I walked out to the truck, the morning air crisp and unforgiving. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life like a beast ready for the hunt. I didn't look back at the house. I looked straight ahead at the road to the courthouse. Daniel wanted to talk about responsibility. Fine, I was going to show him exactly what a decade of duty looked like. The engine of my truck ticked as it cooled in the humid air of the parking lot. I sat there for a second, just breathing. My hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The leather was worn smooth, just like me. I grabbed the scarred leather folder from the passenger seat. My ammunition. I stepped out and the heat of Portsmouth hit me, but I didn't sweat. Not anymore. I walked toward the county courthouse. Massive stone steps, cold, white marble. It looked like a tomb for people's mistakes. People were everywhere, shuffling feet, low whispers about divorce settlements and unpaid debts. The air smelled like stale coffee and anxiety. I kept my chin up. My boots hit that marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic crack. Clack, clack, clack. It was the sound of a soldier on a mission. I didn't look at the crowd. I scanned the hallway like I was clearing a room, looking for bottlenecks, looking for exits. My dress blues felt heavy. The wool was thick, pressing against my skin. The campaign ribbons on my chest, the greens, the reds, the golds, they weren't just decorations. They were the weight of every night I didn't sleep and every friend I didn't bring home. It was the weight of honor. And in this building, honor was a foreign language. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to courtroom 4. The hinges didn't even squeak. On the right side, at the plaintiff's table, sat the enemy, Daniel Holland. He looked like he'd stepped out of a bank brochure. Starched white collar, silk tie, hair slicked back with enough gel to stop a bullet. He was leaning in, whispering to a man in a pinstriped suit who smelled so strongly of cheap, spicy cologne it made my eyes water. They were laughing, a quiet, greasy sound. The moment Daniel saw me, the laughter died. His face didn't soften, his eyes didn't fill with regret. They narrowed. He did a slow crawl with his gaze from my polished shoes up to my medals. I saw the disgust flash in his pupils. He didn't see a daughter who'd served her country. He saw a tool that had stopped working, a piece of property that was finally talking back. I walked to the defendant's table, the left side, the lonely side. I stood there, alone, no lawyer, no support system, just me and a stack of files thick enough to kill a man. I didn't sit down. I stood at a modified attention, back straight, shoulders back. I was a goddamn rock in a sea of shifting sand. Daniel stood up. He walked toward the water pitcher near the center aisle, making sure his path took him right past me. He moved slow, calculated. As he got close, he leaned in. He didn't stop, but his voice hissed through his teeth, low enough that only I could hear it over the hum of the air conditioner. "You didn't have to wear that damn thing out here just to make a joke of yourself, Nicole," he spat. "Playing the hero won't work in here. This is the real world." It was an old trick, the same one he'd used when I was 12. Cut the legs out from under her before she can stand up. Make her feel small. Make her feel like the uniform was just a costume. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I turned my head, slow and deliberate, until my eyes locked onto his. I gave him the look I used for insurgents at checkpoints. Cold, dead, empty of everything but intent. My gaze was a loaded rifle pointed right at his throat. "I didn't wear it for you," I said. My voice was a low growl. It didn't shake, it didn't plead. It was a statement of fact. Daniel's face flickered, just for a millisecond. That mask of confidence cracked. A twitch in his cheek. He'd expected a daughter. He found a captain. He huffed a sharp burst of air through his nose and retreated back to his table. He sat down and started tugging at his French cuffs, looking agitated. The pinstriped lawyer whispered something, but Daniel just stared at the judge's bench. The side door opened. A bailiff stood up, his voice booming through the small room. "All rise." I stood. My medals clinked softly against my chest. The judge, a man who looked like he'd seen every lie ever told in Virginia, swept into the room in a blur of black robes. He didn't look at us. He sat down and adjusted his glasses. The gavel hit the wood. Whack! The sound echoed off the walls like a gunshot. The waiting was over. The battle had begun. The air in courtroom 4 was recycled and stale, carrying the faint, sharp sting of the lawyer's cheap cologne. It was a smell like rotting lemons and desperation. I stood behind the scarred wooden table, my spine a steel rod. My dress blues felt like a second skin, heavy and honest. Across the aisle, Daniel sat with his chin tilted just high enough to look down his nose at me. He looked like he'd spent the morning rehearsing in front of a mirror. His lawyer stood up, a man in a pinstriped suit that didn't quite fit around the middle. He walked toward the center of the room with a practiced, greasy limp. He didn't look at me. He looked at the judge, his voice dropping into a low, theatrical hum that made my skin crawl. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, his hands gesturing broadly toward Daniel. We are here today to discuss a tragedy. Not just a legal one, but a family one. We have Daniel Holland, a man who has spent his life building a legacy in this county. A man who, in his twilight years, has been left to rot by the very person he raised. He turned finally and pointed a pen at me. It felt like he was pointing a gun. Then we have the defendant, Nicole Holland, a woman whose record is defined by one thing: absence. He let the word hang in the air like a bad smell. Absence from her father's life when the roof was caving in. Absence from the community when her family name was being dragged through the mud because of her choices. A consistent pattern of absence. 3 years of absence. 5 years of absence. A decade of total, selfish absence. He said it 5 times in 3 minutes. He didn't say captain. He didn't say service. He didn't mention the sand, the blood, or the cold nights in a foxhole. He erased my life with a single noun. To this court, I wasn't a soldier. I was just a ghost who had failed to mow the lawn. Then it was Daniel's turn. He walked to the witness stand like he was carrying the weight of the world. He moved slow. He adjusted his tie. He cleared his throat with a wet, ragged sound that was purely for show. When he sat down, he didn't look at the judge. He looked at the empty seats in the gallery, making sure everyone saw the heartbroken father. "Mr. Holland," the pinstriped lawyer asked, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, "tell the court about the state of your home while your daughter was away." Daniel let out a long, shaky breath. "It was hard," he rasped. "A master class in manipulation. I'm 68, I've got a bad hip. I spent my nights placing buckets under the leaks in the ceiling. I called, I wrote, I told her the neighborhood was talking. People look at a house like that and they think the family has given up. They think I'm a failure." He finally looked at me. His eyes were cold, hard flints hidden behind a mask of sorrow. "She just disappeared," Daniel said, his voice rising just enough to sound desperate. "She went off on these trips, these missions, while I was out there struggling with the taxes and the rot. And now she comes back, wearing that uniform, acting like she's the one who's been wronged. It's a disgrace. She makes me ashamed to walk down my own street." I didn't move. I didn't let my jaw tighten. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a flinch. I stood at a modified attention, my hands pressed flat against the cool wood of the table. I used the trick I learned at the FOB. I locked my eyes on his Adam's apple. I didn't look at his face. I didn't listen to the words. I just watched the mechanical movement of his throat as he lied. I was a concrete wall. I let his insults hit me like spent brass falling into the dirt. No noise, no reaction. The lawyer sat down, looking smug. Daniel huffed, a sharp burst of air that was supposed to be a sob, and wiped his dry eyes with a linen handkerchief. The judge leaned forward, his glasses slipping down his nose. He looked at me, his face unreadable. "Ms. Holland," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence, "it is your turn. I will remind you again, you have no legal counsel. Do you wish to respond to these claims?" Daniel leaned back, a tiny predatory grin flickering at the corner of his mouth. He thought I was going to cry. He thought I was going to beg for mercy or stumble over my words like a stray dog. I took a slow, deep breath. The air felt like ice in my lungs. I reached down, my fingers grazing the rough, aged leather of my briefcase. I found the brass latch. Clack. The sound was sharp and sudden. It sounded exactly like a round being chambered into an M4. The pinstriped lawyer jumped. Daniel's eyes went wide, his smug mask slipping just an inch. "Your Honor," I said. My voice was a low, resonant drum. It didn't shake. It didn't plead. It was the voice of a woman who had spent a decade giving orders in places where death was the only constant. "I'm ready." The only sound in courtroom 4 was the frantic, rhythmic clacking of the court reporter's typewriter. It sounded like bone-hitting plastic. Over my head, the fluorescent lights hummed a low, sickly tune, flickering just enough to cast jagged shadows across the pinstriped suit of Daniel's lawyer. The man was sweating now. I could see the dark circles forming under his armpits. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. I stood up. I did not rush. I did not lean on the table for support. I stood straight, my heels clicking once against the hard floor. A sound of finality. I did not abandon my family, I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a decade spent shouting over helicopter rotors. It cut through the room like a cold front. I served my country. My absence was not a vacation to avoid my responsibilities. It was a choice to fulfill a higher one. And if I did not come home often, it was because I knew exactly what was waiting for me here. A house is not a home when the man inside only sees you as a ledger. The accusation hit Daniel like a physical punch. He did not just sit there. He lunged forward against the railing of the witness stand, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He looked like he was about to burst out of his starched shirt. "There, you see?" Daniel barked, his voice cracking. The mask of the grieving father was gone, replaced by a raw, ugly snarl. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "I did not kick her out. I told everyone she shamed me. People were talking, Judge. They were whispering about how my own daughter was a stubborn, rebellious brat who cared more about a uniform than her own blood." The air in the room seemed to vanish. The judge narrowed his eyes, his mouth a thin, hard line. The pinstriped lawyer reached out, his hand trembling as he grabbed the edge of Daniel's coat, trying to pull him back down. But it was too late. Daniel was shouting at the ceiling now, his ego finally overriding his act. I looked at him. I did not feel anger. I felt a cold, sharp pity. It was the look you give a dying animal that is still trying to bite. "You said I made you look bad," I said, speaking slowly, letting every word hit the floor like a spent shell casing. "And you decided that making you look bad was the same thing as being a bad daughter. Those are not the same thing, Daniel. You told that lie so many times that you actually started to believe it. You turned me into a ghost so you could play the martyr." Daniel's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the realization that he had just admitted his entire case was built on nothing but his own vanity. I did not let him breathe. I reached into my bag and pulled out the heavy, leather-bound folder. The pages were stuffed tight, jagged with the yellow highlighted lines I had drawn the night before. I walked forward. My boots did not falter. I handed the file to the clerk. "Your Honor," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "This is Exhibit 1. I asked the court to re-examine the definition of financial irresponsibility that the plaintiff has been using to attack my character." The clerk handed the file up to the bench. The judge did not look at Daniel. He did not look at me. He pushed his glasses up his nose and began to flip through the pages. The sound of paper sliding against paper was the only thing left in the room. If you have ever been the scapegoat for someone else's ego, if you have ever been the one they pointed at while they picked your pockets, hit that like button right BGO. I need to know I am not the only one standing in this storm. Comment enough below if you have finally decided to set your boundaries and stop being their victim. Let us hear your voice. The judge stopped flipping. He stared at a single page for what felt like an hour. His face went pale, then hard. He looked down at Daniel, then back at the numbers highlighted in yellow. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was an ice storm. Daniel started to sweat, his eyes darting toward the folder as if it were a bomb about to go off. The judge looked at me, his eyes dark with something I could not name. "Ms. Holland," the judge whispered, "where exactly did this money come from?" The judge leaned forward, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose like a vulture waiting for a carcass. He stared at Daniel, long and hard. The silence in the room was not empty. It was heavy, weighted with the rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's keys. "Mr. Holland," the judge's voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the old oak benches. "You just testified under oath that you were the one footing the bill for this estate while your daughter was away?" Daniel swallowed hard. His throat bobbed behind his silk tie. He gave a small, hesitant nod, his eyes darting toward the gallery to see if his neighbors were still watching. The judge held up a single bank statement, shaking it like a dirty rag. "This document says something else entirely. Property taxes, shingles for the roof, the new heating system. 8 years of bills, all paid, all on time, and every single cent came directly from Captain Holland's personal account. A low murmur rippled through the room. It sounded like a nest of disturbed hornets. Daniel's lawyer looked like he had just swallowed a gallon of spoiled milk, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Daniel did not back down. He gripped the wood of the witness stand until his knuckles turned bone white. "So what?" he shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate, ugly edge. "Anyone can set up a damn auto pay. Throwing a few dollars around from thousands of miles away does not mean she was there. She just wanted to play the martyr while I did the real work." He was breathing fast now, a frantic, ragged sound. Sweat was beading on his forehead, making his expensive hair gel look like greasy oil. The smug country club confidence he had walked in with was dead and buried. I did not give him an inch. I stood at a modified attention, my hands flat on the table, my gaze locked on his Adam's apple. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a serrated blade, "please look at the source of that money." The judge flipped the page. The sound of the paper was sharp and violent in the quiet room. His face turned into a mask of cold stone. "These funds," the judge whispered, his voice suddenly thick with a gravity that froze the air, "are not from a regular salary. They were pulled from a hazard pay combat fund. And the last 2 years, every dime came from military disability compensation." The room went dead silent. Daniel froze. His eyes bulged as he looked at me, realizing the words were not just ink on paper. They were blood. He had been living in a house kept together by money I was paid for an injury he never even bothered to ask about. Every time he turned on the heat or looked at the new roof, he was using the price of my broken body. The pinstriped lawyer started frantically shoving papers into his briefcase, his hands shaking so hard he dropped his pen. He started mumbling something about withdrawing the financial arguments, his voice a pathetic squeak. But the judge was not done. He did not let them move. He reached under the bench and pulled out a separate manila envelope. It was thick, heavy with the weight of things that stay buried in the dark. On the top right corner, there was a red plastic tag, the seal for declassified Department of Defense documents. "Since we are talking about absence and shame," the judge said, his eyes locking onto Daniel like a laser sight on a rifle, "do you actually have any idea where your daughter was and what she was doing during the week of Hurricane Elias?" Daniel's mouth opened. He looked like a fish gasping for air on a hot dock. Nothing came out but a dry, pathetic wheeze. He looked at the red tag, and for the first time in his life, he looked small. I felt the weight of the grandfather's compass in my pocket, cold against my chest. I did not smile. I did not feel victory. I just felt the grit of the truth finally surfacing through the mud. The judge snapped the red plastic tag. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The judge leaned forward, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose like a vulture waiting for a carcass. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the pinstriped lawyer who was currently trying to evaporate into his chair. He looked at the red folder. The air in courtroom 4 was thick, heavy with the smell of old paper and the hum of the air conditioner. The only sound was the dry, rhythmic ticking of the court reporter's keys. It sounded like bone-hitting plastic. "I have the declassified after-action report here," the judge said. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the old oak benches. Hurricane Elias. The flooding had turned the county into a swamp of raw sewage and downed power lines. Communications were dark. The local infrastructure had flatlined. It was a disaster zone. He paused, the silence stretching until it felt like it might snap. The sound of a page turning was as loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. Captain Nicole Holland didn't wait for orders she couldn't receive. She established an air and ground corridor. She moved supplies when the roads were gone. She coordinated evacuations under zero visibility conditions. By the time the storm broke, she had personally overseen the rescue of 47 civilians. 47 people in this county are alive today because of her. Not a single casualty on her watch. The Department of Defense cited her for exceptional valor. Not just for her skill, but for her initiative. The room went cold. Dead air. Daniel's lawyer dropped his pen. Click, clack. The plastic hit the oak floor and rolled toward the center aisle. Daniel blinked. Once, twice. His mouth hung open just enough to show his expensive dental work, his face pale under the bronze makeup. He looked like he'd been hit in the chest with a shovel. This wasn't the rebellious, absent brat he'd described for 3 hours. This was a war hero. I could hear the neighbors in the back of the room. People Daniel had manipulated for years, starting to whisper. Their voices were a low, ugly hiss of realization. But that's not what interests me most, the judge continued. His eyes were like laser sights, locked onto Daniel's sweating forehead. I've spent the morning looking at the defendant's bank records. The same records you claimed showed her shameful lack of responsibility and her disregard for this community. He held up a sheet of paper, the yellow highlighter marks glowing like neon under the fluorescent lights. While you were telling this community she was a disgrace, Captain Holland was taking her pay, her combat pay, and sending it here. Anonymous donations. To the County Veterans Relief Fund. She's been quietly paying to keep roofs over the heads of families who lost everything in the very community you claim she abandoned. She's been doing the work while you've been doing the talking, Mr. Holland. Daniel's lip trembled. A thin line of sweat ran down his temple, carving a path through his bronze makeup. He turned his head, slow and jerky, to look at me. The smug country club confidence was gone. He looked old. He looked small. You did that? He rasped. It wasn't an apology. It was the sound of a man realizing his bank account was the only thing he had left to fight with, and it was empty. I didn't smile. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a smirk or a triumphant nod. I kept my face like granite. My spine was a steel rod. I stood at a modified attention, my hands flat on the table. I didn't think it mattered who did it, I said. One sentence, short, blunt. It tore the heart out of his vanity. To me, the work was the point. To him, the point was who got the applause. I had spent 10 years building a life out of duty. He had spent 68 years building a house out of mirrors. And today, I was breaking every single one of them. The pinstriped lawyer scrambled to his feet, his face the color of old parchment. Your Honor, we would like to request a recess to confer with my client. Denied, the judge snapped. He didn't even look up from the folder. We are well past the point of conferral. The facts have been entered into the record. He reached for the gavel, a heavy piece of dark wood that had seen 1,000 lies. The plaintiff's petition to seize property and strip inheritance is denied in its entirety. The defendant retains all rights, titles, and interests. This court is adjourned. He brought the gavel down. Crack! The sound echoed off the high ceilings. It was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. The judge stood up, his black robes billowing as he moved. He looked at Daniel one last time. His voice was a whip crack in the sudden, ringing silence. Mr. Holland, he said, sometimes the thing that shames a family isn't what the children do. It's what the parents choose not to see. He turned and walked out the side door, the heavy oak closing behind him. The courtroom was silent. Daniel sat there, slumped in his chair, looking like a deflated balloon in an expensive suit. He was finally just an old man, trapped in a room full of people who knew exactly who he was. I didn't look back. I had the compass in my pocket and the truth in my hand. I walked down the stone steps toward the truck. The sun was hot on my metals, but I had never felt colder. I was free, but I was also entirely, perfectly, alone. The courtroom didn't erupt into applause. There was no slow-motion cheering or music swelling in the background. Real life doesn't work like that. It's just a slow, painful leak of adrenaline and the sudden realization that your ears are ringing. The spectators cleared out, their voices hushed like they were leaving a funeral for a man they never really liked. I stood at the defense table and started gathering the thick stack of files, my ammunition. The paper felt thin and brittle between my fingers. I tucked them back into the scarred leather folder, sliding the brass latch shut. Clack! The sound was final. Daniel hadn't moved an inch. He was still sitting in the witness stand, slumped forward like a sack of wet laundry. His expensive silk tie was crooked. The hair gel had failed, leaving a few thin gray strands hanging over his forehead like cobwebs. For 30 years, that man had been a giant in my mind, a monster who could erase my existence with a single sigh. Now, he just looked like an old man who had spent too much money on a suit that didn't fit his soul. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel sad. I just felt finished. Like a mission where the objective was secured, but the base was still a pile of smoldering rubble. I walked out into the hallway. The marble floor was a mirror of golden afternoon light stretching toward the exit. It was quiet out here, away from the heat and the lies. I headed for the elevators, my boots echoing with a steady, disciplined rhythm. I caught my reflection in the glass of the main doors, back straight, shoulders square. The dress blues looked sharp, but they felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds of lead. An old man was standing by the elevator bank. He was wearing a faded denim jacket and a ball cap with a silver 82nd Airborne pin on the crown. He was leaning on a heavy oak cane, his eyes milky with age but sharp enough to catch the ribbons on my left breast. As I got closer, he straightened up. It was a slow, painful movement, but his spine found its old iron. He brought his hand to the brim of his hat in a crisp, sharp salute that smelled of old tobacco and dignity. "Thank you for your service, Captain," he said. His voice was a gravelly rasp. I stopped. I didn't smile, but I felt a sudden warmth in my chest that the judge's gavel hadn't provided. I brought my hand up, returning the salute with the same precision I'd used on 1,000 flight lines from Portsmouth to Bagram. "Thank you, sir," I replied. He gave me a small, knowing nod and stepped onto the elevator. A stranger had given me more honor in 5 seconds than my father had given me in 30 years. "Nicole!" The voice behind me was dry, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. Daniel was standing 10 feet back, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He looked smaller, shrunk by the court's decision. The pinstriped lawyer was nowhere to be seen, probably off to find a client who could still pay. "I was wrong," Daniel said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the patterns in the marble floor. I told everyone you were the one who made us look bad. That you were the one dragging the name through the mud." He cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound that made me wince. "It was me. I was the one doing it. I see that now." He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and watery. He was waiting for the hug, waiting for me to tell him it was okay and that we could go get dinner at the club and pretend the last decade never happened. He wanted the absolution. He wanted the no contact to end before it even started. I stood my ground. I looked at the man who had traded my blood for shingles and my dignity for a golf membership. I didn't feel the old urge to scream. I didn't feel the need to explain my pain for the millionth time. "I know," I said. I didn't add anything else. "No, I forgive you. No, let's work on it, just the truth." I knew he was the problem. I had always known. The world knew it too. I knew he was the problem. I had always known the world would finally see who you really are, Daniel. The Virginia sun was a hammer. It beat down on the back of my neck, relentless and white-hot. I wasn't wearing the dress blues today. No medals, no ribbons. I had on an old, sweat-stained gray t-shirt and jeans that had seen too many oil changes. I was on my knees in the dry dirt of the backyard. Knox was sprawled out in the shade of the porch, his tail giving a lazy, rhythmic thump against the floorboards every few seconds. The smell of cedar, salt, and sun-baked earth was thick in the air. The legal gunpowder from yesterday's trial had finally settled. Now there was just the work. I gripped the wooden handle of my hammer. It was worn smooth, fitting into my palm like a piece of my own skin. I lined up a rusted nail on the picket fence and drove it home. Whack, whack, whack. Each strike felt like I was pinning the world back into its proper place. The wood splintered slightly under the force, but the line held. I was building my own perimeter now, a real one. The screen door behind me gave a long, rusted groan. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I knew the heavy, uneven rhythm of those footsteps. They were slower than they used to be, less certain. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking under his weight. He wasn't the sharp, slick man from the courtroom. The pinstriped suit was gone. He wore a thin beige cardigan that made his shoulders look narrow and slumped. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the dirt near my boots. He stood there for a long time, just watching. I ignored him. I picked up another nail from the plastic bucket and kept my focus on the fence. I wasn't waiting for a thank you or a good job. Those things didn't exist in this house. I always thought, Daniel started. His voice was thin, brittle, like dry glass. He was digging through the trash of his own pride, looking for one last excuse to hold on to. If you weren't here, it meant you didn't care, that you just moved on to something better and left me to rot with the leaks and the taxes. I stopped. I didn't drop the hammer. I stood up slowly, wiping the grit and rust from my palms onto my thighs. I turned and looked him dead in the eye. No anger, no yelling. Just the cold, hard facts of a decade spent in the dark. It didn't mean I didn't care, Daniel, I said. My voice was a low rumble. It just meant I didn't feel welcome. The words hit the porch like lead weights. Daniel didn't argue. He couldn't. The lie he'd spent years telling himself had finally run out of air. He looked away, his eyes tracking a hawk circling high above the pines. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that caught the midday light. A dull, tarnished silver. It was Grandpa's pocket watch, the heavy mechanical heart of the Holland family. Daniel had clung to that thing like a scepter for years, a symbol of a power he never actually earned. He held it out toward me. His hand was shaking, not much, but enough that the silver chain rattled against his knuckles. I've been holding on to this, he rasped. Didn't really know what to do with it lately. Figured maybe you should be the one carrying it now. It wasn't an apology. Daniel didn't have the guts for that. It was a white flag. A total, unconditional surrender. I stepped forward, the dust kicking up around my boots, and took the watch. It was heavy, cold. It sat in my palm like an anchor. Night fell fast, bringing a chill that smelled of pine needles and damp stone. I sat at the small wooden desk in the corner of my room. The house was quiet. No more shouting, no more scheming. I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform jacket hanging on the chair and pulled out the brass compass. The glass was still cracked. The needle was still hunting for north. I set the compass down on the scarred wood. Then I took the silver pocket watch and placed it right next to it. 2 pieces of metal, one for time, one for direction. They sat there, solid and unmoving. I looked at my hands. They were stained with cedar oil and dirt. I wasn't the girl who ran away anymore. I was the one holding the map. I was the one keeping the time. I stood up and walked to the window. The woods were black, but the stars were out. I reached for the light switch. Mission complete, I whispered.